Hey, I know that you guys would continue to talk through the entire class if I didn't say anything. Sometimes I'm tempted. Then I could just teach the same lesson next week. I can't see you guys either because I don't have my glasses on. Bearfield, in his book, The Prophet Motive, gives several criteria for assessing the claims of predictive prophecy. And these are the criteria. And they should be somewhat common to, well known to us by now. First of all, the prediction should occur well in advance of the fulfillment. There should be no way to suspect that the prophecy was made after the fact. To predict, for instance, that there's going to be a bad accident is meaningless if you already are watching a car screeching towards a semi-truck, right? Secondly, the prediction should be accurate. It must be able to be confirmed by evidence of some kind, historical evidence in our case. It can't be something like psychic hotline, all right? Fulfillment of prophecy should occur in an impartial manner. There should be no evidence of collusion or manipulation. In other words, like we talked about in an earlier lesson, there can't be anything like a two-headed coin or a big bag of marbles that are all the same color. Okay? You can't have something that's rigged. The next one is the fulfillment should be obvious to any reasonable person. So, for instance, if we take a look at some people that made predictions like J.P. Morgan's dad, who predicted that electricity was nothing but a passing fad. Or in 1876, the president of Western Union dismissed the invention of the telephone as just a toy. And I remember reading about one governor of a state one time that said, yeah, I could see how we could use one of these in every city, about the telephone. Bill Gates, on the other hand, once said, I don't know why you'd ever need a graphical user interface. So there's a lot of these guys are short-sighted when it comes to things like this. This does not suggest that the prediction is totally free of ambiguity. Okay? If you take someone like Nostradamus, who has been in the news off and on over the years, lived, I don't know how long ago, I can't remember. Do you remember when Yeah, it was a long, long time ago when Nostradamus lived. But they take the predictions that he makes now that are extremely vague and say, yeah, this happened in New York City. That's what Nostradamus said. Had nothing to do with it. You can't prove that whatsoever because there's no historical evidence, and he did not even know what New York City was at the time. So it must be obvious. Predictive prophecy must be dynamic. In other words, it must be ongoing, repetitive, and consistent. Anyone can be lucky once in a while. Everybody in here remember Jean Dixon? Used to make a lot of predictions, and she was best known for making what prediction? Anybody remember? Kennedy assassination. She had said that before Kennedy died, said he was going to die in office. But when you look, she was a psychic. She was a person that did predictions, and he went, oh man, she's really great. But she only got like less than 5% of her predictions right. So you can see that she went out and she made a ton and like lots and lots, thousands of these things, and then a very few of them came true, and everybody thought she was great. That can't be the case, all right? If you are to believe a person is a prophet, then, as the Bible says, the number of predictions should be 100%. And then finally, the prediction should suggest supernatural guidance. In other words, the prediction should go against human reasoning of the time. It must have had help from outside of space and time to be able to be made. All right? Those are some good criteria. So when anybody tells you that the Old Testament predicts such and such of what's happening now, it don't follow these criteria. All right? So today, we're going to go to a different, wrong one. We're going to go to another nation. We're going to talk about Egypt. Where in the Bible did Egypt first receive its warnings and condemnations from God? Yeah, Exodus. All right, easy question. And you should know that because not long ago we did an entire class on the first 20 chapters of Exodus. We still got the rest of it to finish, but those judgments at that time against Egypt came in about 1400 BC in the form of the 10 plagues and the things that God told Moses to tell Egypt. But later in history, between 750 and 500 BC, so 800 or so years later, other Old Testament prophets prophesied against Egypt and told things that were going to happen to it with some specificity. In our Exodus class, we discussed chapters 1 through 20. One of the things that we should have noticed is how powerful and influential the kingdom of Egypt was at the time of Moses. Today, we mostly think of a great kingdom as lasting a few hundred years. The USSR, the actual Soviet Socialist Republic, lasted 70 years. The United States has lasted for 250, roughly. Rome, when it was in its republic form, lasted for 450 years. And then after it changed over to an empire, it lasted for almost another 450 years. So it was like 900 years that Rome was around, which is a long time. But ancient Egypt dominated the known world for over 3,000 years. It's the longest known empire that archaeology knows about. This is what one of the articles I read said about the long-lasting Egyptian empire. It said Egypt became wealthy through farming and trade. Its power was built up by a strong government led by pharaohs and staffed by well-trained officials. The nation was defended by a huge army. Even though the total collapse of Egypt did not come until 30 BC, which is several hundred years after these prophets are prophesying, at that time it was made into a Roman province. Egypt began to falter after not long after God's prophets predicted that it would come to an end. Today, we think of Egypt as being famous for these kinds of things: pyramids, pharaohs, mummies, and tombs. And that's what we're taught. That's what we see. That's what's cool, so to speak. But none of these is what was actually the most important about ancient Egypt. Egypt was the best at everything it did. Absolutely everything. The Nile, for instance, made Egypt an envy of the world. The fields along the tributaries grew abundant crops, so much so that we see many in the Old Testament, and we know from history many other nations would come to Egypt during times when food was short and when there were famines. I mean, that's what Jacob sent the sons there for, because of time of famine. And I think if I remember right, Abraham did the same thing, Jacob's grandfather. Its fisheries were abundant. Its garment industry was stupendous due to both the Egyptian cotton and the skill of the weavers who made the cloth. Its government was stable, and the people of Egypt did not war with one another. It was something that other nations didn't do, but for long periods of time, they were very peaceful. And its craftsmen were the best in the world throughout Egypt's reign. Even at the time of Jesus and after, Egypt was capable of producing enough food to be called the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. According to archaeologist Sarah Parcak, ancient Egypt was way more vast, much, much larger than anyone has believed up to this point. And to show that, next couple of slides, this slide here is of a place called Tanis in Egypt, and you can see that it's nothing but dry, sandy ground for as far as you can see. But if you take a picture of that same spot, like Sarah Parcak has been able to do, from outer space with infrared technology, this is what you see under the ground. There was a city there. And she has mapped this out and found that the entire desert area of Egypt has this kinds of formations all over underneath the ground. This was a lot bigger than most people think Egypt was in modern times because it's all disappeared. It's all gone. The grandeur of ancient Egypt is not anything like the mediocre Egypt that we see today. And we're about to find out why that is. When the Bible's prophets prophesied their predictions, Egypt's mystique dominated the Western world at the time. Not even the Assyrians or the Babylonian empires seemed capable of successfully challenging Egypt. They were that big and that powerful. Even Israel was pro-Egypt at this time. Despite this political climate, one prophet after another began to make numerous predictions pertaining to Egypt and its downfall. Who in their right mind at the time would say such a thing of an empire that was that big, okay, and that powerful? 8 complete chapters in the Old Testament, 680 verses total, expound on these rebukes. And no other country in the Old Testament has received anywhere near as much condemnation as ancient Egypt has. Of all the Old Testament chapters and verses dedicated to predicting Egypt's demise, none are more significant than Isaiah chapter 19. That one chapter contains 7 major predictive themes that speaks of God's judgment against the mighty nation that once held his people bondage. Isaiah predictions are also very specific. They include Egypt would be harassed with civil war conflicts, which is something that they never had. The Nile, its life giving properties would lessen. The Egyptian celebrated canals would become putrefied and unusable. The prolific vegetation that grew along the waterways would diminish. There would be a dramatic decline in Egypt's fisheries. Egypt's envied craftsmen and artisans and its labor force would be lost, and Egypt's renowned military would be crushed. Notice that these predictions spell out things in very specific detail, and collectively, these predictions are unique to Egypt. These aren't the same kind of predictions that were made about Syria or Babylon or some of the other ones we're going to talk about. All right? These are very specific. These aren't something like Nostradamus saying there's going to be something that is going to happen and it's going to be bad. Okay? These are spelled out about Egypt itself while Egypt was around, not some New York City 1,000 years in the future. Do you see the difference? Okay? So, let's start talking about some of these. Jeremiah laments in chapter 8, verse 11, that they cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. Jeremiah was not talking about Egypt. Jeremiah at this time was talking about Israel, talking about Judah, and the nature of the world at the time. But when Jeremiah made this, it did not apply to Egypt, because Egypt was had a strong civil government that got along. So, but each of the statements, such a statement would not make sense about Egypt. Though they had normal disagreements, civil conflict seldom occurred in Egypt's early history. Records from ancient Egypt suggest that when trouble erupted, it came from inhabitants of outside kingdoms and not from within. And even when there was a great change in the structure of the Egyptian government and the Thespian high priest usurped the throne during the 21st dynasty, it didn't result in a civil war. That's how these people got along. Therefore, when Isaiah was the one that told Egypt that violence and civil unrest would happen, it would not have made sense, because Egypt had long been notoriously stable. Yet Isaiah says this in chapter 19, verse 2. I, talking about God, will incite Egypt against Egypt, and man will fight against his brother, man against his neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. Very specific, and specific to Egypt, mentioned by name. Not long afterwards, Isaiah's prediction, Egypt went through a period of civil unrest and war among themselves. This divisiveness paved the way for what would happen as far as some of the successful invasions of the country in its history. In other words, it was after this that, number one, they started having civil unrest, and it weakened the nation enough where they could and were finally invaded over time. The historian Diodorus describes the period as if he were reading Isaiah's prophecy. He says there was anarchy in Egypt. The people fall into broils and tumults and slaughter one another. Eventually, this internal strife weakened Egypt, which in turn aided invaders to bring Egypt under foreign control. And with her loss of self-determination, Egyptian culture would begin to vanish. The Greeks and the Egyptians, the Greeks called Egypt the gift of the Nile. The Nile River was a place where there was just such abundance because of that river itself. And without the Nile, Egypt would have been a dusty, barren wasteland full of sand dunes and deserts, kind of like it is today. But it wasn't always. The Egyptians worshipped, I think you remember from the Exodus class, the Nile in the form of the god Hapi. And you notice, just like I have in the past, you can actually go out and buy a Hapi t-shirt yourself if you want. Periodically, to get Hapi on their side, they would take a young maiden, dress her in a bridal dress, and throw her into the river as a sacrifice. A huge network of canals channeled water deep into the desert and transformed the burning sands into productive farmland. Now, I tried to find a better illustration of what people might have thought, but this is the only one I could find. It's a kid's illustration that shows how they would little by little take the Nile River, make it into smaller tributaries, and then make it into smaller irrigation dishes. And then such a land like you saw in Parkak's photo, there was a lot of that went deep into the desert, and they would have irrigation that would go a long, long ways and have mountains and mountains of farmland to be able to farm in that desert area. I did happen to see a short video here not too long ago when I was doing some research, where there are people nowadays that are trying to take very, very, very deep wells in Egypt, sink them down enormously deep, and there's water down there, and then bring it up and then make some more of these kinds of canals to have oasis places where big cities can survive and they can get water and grow crops and have cities. But this is a project that's kind of in its infancy right now, but it's something that they're trying to do. But the Old Testament prophets, the Egyptians became so successful at farming this wilderness that even centuries later the Romans said that Egypt was the breadbasket of the world. In order to supply that much wheat and grain to the world, you had to be able to farm a whole lot more land than what Egypt is capable of today, like a massive amount more. But the Old Testament prophets said that the irrigation canals would be dried up and the river would stink. The abundant plant life would decline and the fisheries would disappear. Isaiah chapter 19, starting with verse 5, says this: the waters from the sea will dry up, and the river will be parched and dry. The canals will emit a stench. The streams of Egypt will thin out and dry up. The reeds and rushes will rot away. The bulrushes by the Nile, by the edge of the Nile, and all the sown fields by the Nile will become dry and driven away and be no more. And the fisheries will grieve, and all those who cast a line into the Nile will mourn, and those who spread their nets on the water will dwindle away. Ezekiel said exactly the same thing in chapter 30. Now think about this. Isaiah wrote specifically about Egypt between 700 and 740 BC. Ezekiel said these same things between 592 and 570 BC. That's 150 years difference. These guys didn't know each other, and yet they said the same things, exactly the same things about Egypt, and then they came to pass. Most of this happened gradually over time until eventually when the Muslim armies seized Egypt in around 650 AD, in other words, about 1200 or so years later, they totally neglected the canals. Muslims took the monies that were intended to keep these canals going and in repair and stole it and used it for personal gain. Once, one historian at the time wrote this: the canals have been diminished and dried up. This is what a lot of those canals look like today. Look at the bottom right corner. There's people actually taking a bath in there. Yeah. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying there isn't big cities in Egypt and that Egypt has some power in the region a little bit, but nothing even close to what they had before. Not even close. Today, these canals remain clogged, covered with sand and debris, and these are some of the bigger ones. The smaller ones are all dried up and gone. You can't even see those anymore. A modern writer once said that the canals all need to be deepened. They run dry at the critical season each year, and if these canals were cleaned, Egypt's agriculture production would soar. But because of political, economic, and religious reasons, this will not happen. And a lot of people blame this on politics. And that's true. A lot of people blame this on religious practices and economics. That's true. But it was predicted. But we also have people that I've seen just this week, I couldn't believe it, that are saying that this decline in Egypt over time was due to climate change. I kid you not. Yeah.
Looking at that, is that the canals or is that the Nile?
No, those are the canals. That's not the Nile. The Nile is huge. The Nile, I looked up to see what the biggest river in the world is, and it depends on how you gauge it. Okay? The biggest one is the Amazon, but the longest one is the Nile. All right? So some people say the Nile, some people say the Amazon. No, it's huge.
Okay, so the Nile was the god that they worshiped, right?
Correct.
The Nile wasn't just water.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. The Nile was it. To everybody that knew about Egypt, that was in anywhere near that Middle Eastern area or the Roman Empire or anything through the ages, Nile was the reason Egypt was like it was. As the canals began to disappear, so did the flora and a lot of the plant life along both the Nile and specifically the larger canals that went from it. Isaiah chapter 19, starting in verse 6, says, "The canals will become foul and stink. The branches of Egypt's Nile will diminish and dry up. The reeds and the rushes will rot away. There will be bare places by the Nile, on the brink of the Nile, and all that is sown by the Nile will be parched, will dry away, and will be no more." What is being referred to here are the man-made tributaries maintained for thousands of years. Nothing will grow because these tributaries and irrigation canals would dry up and become putrid and stink, which we just saw. As a result, none of the plants that formerly dotted the banks will grow. What was one of the main plants that Egypt had at the time that was very, very useful? Anybody remember? Papyrus. Yeah. There was others, but the main one was papyrus. Papyrus is known to us a lot in our time because of its ability that they made paper out of it. And a lot of the things that we find that are written in ancient Egypt that have been stored someplace are on papyrus. And they might be papyrus, that paper that was made in Egypt and sent even to other places. Egypt exported everything that they actually had. But papyrus was to Egypt as buffalo was to the American Indian. They used every part. It grew 15 feet tall. It was used for firewood, utensils, small boats, sails, mats, bedding, ropes, clothes. They ate part of it. They drank the water and the fluid that came from it. It was one of those things that they used every part, and every part was useful. But now, water plants like the papyrus are scarce on the banks of the Nile, and they don't even grow on the tributaries, just like was said by the prophets. The culture was the next thing that was talked about. Egypt had a highly skilled workforce. This is an Egyptian relief that portrays many kinds of skilled labor that flourished in ancient Egypt. And if you look, you can see lots of different ones. And I think this is a small part of a much larger relief. Their talents included tailors and seamstresses, craftsmen of all kinds, architects, engineers, artists, many different kinds of tradesmen. The skill of their handiwork amazes even people today. I mean, just look at the outsides of some of these tombs. We're going to talk about two of those in a little more detail in a moment. But, you know, those are amazing. But on the inside of those tombs, I find it even more amazing. Okay? Even the paint has lasted for thousands and thousands of years. That's actually inside. That's the way they were originally painted. And you can see that, even though those paintings might be as much as 4,000 years old. That paint is still there. They claim that the outsides, when you look at some of this, a lot of that originally was probably painted just as colorful. So what we see in Egypt today is kind of a sand drab color. Is not what you would see if you'd have went there. And even the pyramids, they say, had a glaze on them at the time where they would shine like they were almost like plated silver or something like that, and just be just as glowing as you can imagine. But of course, that's all gone. Over the years, it's worn away, and now what we see is a rough side of the pyramids. Egypt didn't look the same way as it does now, not even close. Ancient merchants sought garments made in Egypt. One writing states that by the end of the first dynasty, the Egyptians were producing the finest linen of the ancient world. First Kings puts it this way. Solomon had horses brought out of Egypt and linen yarn. The king's merchants received the linen yarn at a price. In other words, they had to pay a high price to get the good quality of linen that came from Egypt, even in Solomon's day. Phoenician traders became wealthy by selling Egyptian linen and embroidered cloth. According to ancient historians at the time, Egypt's thread count was high, and they had such detail that they had fine hieroglyphics woven into the cloth itself as they made it. Isaiah chapter 19, starting in verse 9, says, those who work the fine flax will despair, which actually can be translated as will be put to shame, so to speak. In other words, they're going to be shamed because they can't make it anymore. And the weavers of the fine linen will be in despair. Look at Egypt today. We don't know even how they made the pyramids a lot of times. And even with our modern equipment, we don't know whether or not we could do some of the things that they did back then. This prediction has indeed been fulfilled in many different ways and many different forms in Egypt. Thebes was one of the main cities in ancient Egypt. In fact, it was much of the time it was the capital of Egypt, and it was very powerful. The pyramids were well known by most people, or are well known nowadays by most people. They are indeed grand, but there are lesser known pyramids from the ancient Egypt that I think are also amazing. Temples, not necessarily pyramids. I don't know if I said pyramids, but the pyramids are what we look at today. But look at something like the temple that was built for, what's the name of that? Hatshepsut. Okay, that was one of the pharaohs in, what did it say? Did it say the 8th dynasty? 18th dynasty up there. But that doesn't even give it justice until you look at it in its context. I've seen this over the years quite a little bit in pictures and stuff. And if there's one place in Egypt I'd want to go, that's what I'd like to see. I just think that's amazing. Built right out of the rocks. That is one of them. But possibly the greatest of all of the temple areas was one called El Karnak. Thebes was the capital of Egypt at the time when El Karnak was built. The temple complex had a 360-foot wide entranceway with 20 sanctuaries on the inside. This is part of it. And those kinds of statues in the columns and stuff were everywhere in this particular city. What they call the Amun sanctuary alone was 170 by 329 feet, longer than a football field. The roof was suspended by huge, giant statues, 134 of them altogether, 70 feet high and 12 feet in diameter at the base. This is what they think that complex looked like in ancient Egyptian times. I mean, what we see here is just like a couple of pieces that are still standing, but they can find, like archaeology does, they can find very easily where the footings and foundations originally were. And so this is pretty much what they think it looked like then. And it's huge. It's monstrous. There are many, many such images of various temple complexes that are all over Egypt that you can't even hardly see anymore. But people like Sarah Parkak in her satellite images have been able to find where some of these are. I tried to find it years ago when I first read about her. I saw a video that she was presenting, and it showed an area of land that was just desert. And then all of a sudden, she overlaid that with the shot from the satellite that showed all of the zigzagging lines and stuff that were all over the place. And then they made it 3D and they raised it up so you could see what that area would have looked like should the pyramids that were broken down in all the town houses and everything, and it just like came to life. They had this kind of stuff in places that are now desert. But Ezekiel, chapter 30, verses 14 through 16, describe what would happen to Thebes. God would execute judgment, multiples would be cut off, and the city would be broken up. One by one, each of these judgments was carried out, and these predictions can, like all the others, be substantiated. When Ezekiel spoke of judgment, he did so in the plural, as if it would happen more than once. More than once, Thebes would be feel the sting of oppression and war. Around 525 BC, for instance, a Persian king named Cambyses defeated and combined the combined armies of Upper Egypt and triumphantly marched his soldiers into Thebes. Over the next several years, some would come and fail, and some would come and make headway little by little. Not long after this, the Egyptians were celebrating a dedication feast to the god that was known as Apis the bull. And the person that was coming back from that battle went by this area again and thought that the celebration was because the guy had lost the battle in Ethiopia, and he got angry, and that was the provocation that made him go in and destroy it even more, destroy that area even more. Parts of the city at that time were burned, and the main giant wall was partially torn down, and many of the temples were badly damaged and destroyed. Here are a few of the kinds of areas we're talking about that have been found in recent years, and each one of these has places that would have a temple or maybe even a pyramid of some kind or another that have taken years to be able to find and know what they are, but little by little they're discovering quite a few of these. Later in the 1st century BC, the grandfather of Cleopatra laid siege to Thebes. Thebes resisted for 3 years, but finally Much of the city was leveled, and many temples were badly damaged. In the centuries from the time of the Romans until today, many others have conquered and defeated Egypt and Thebes over the years. The once feared army of ancient Egypt no longer has an adequate war machine. It took centuries, but Egypt is no longer a superpower. Even the tiny country of Israel has defeated Egypt in wars in 1956, 1973, and in the 1980s. It just can't do it. Ezekiel also said that there would be a decline in Thebes' vast population, which happened over time. Modern visitors, which go there to talk about the people that mostly live on the Nile River and very few in the surrounding deserts. A new city called Lexar, 16 miles away from the original Thebes, is there, and it's a kind of a large city, but is on the opposite side of the Nile. So a lot of people say, when you read, they'll say Luxor is where ancient Thebes was. Well, it's really not. Thebes have never been built back up. It's quite a ways away, and it's in the desert, and it's a tourist attraction more than anything else, and it's on the opposite side of the river. In the northern part of Egypt, there was a city called Memphis, and it was a huge city also. Ezekiel chapter 30 tells us about what would happen to Memphis. It says, I will destroy the idols and put an end to the images in Memphis. No longer will there be a prince in Egypt, and I will spread fear throughout the land. Destroying the idols in Memphis would have been a hard thing to do because they were numbered in the thousands. But what happened to Memphis was different than what happened to Thebes. Today, you can still see grandeur at Thebes. It's a tourist attraction. But they're not even sure where Memphis is nowadays, the original back then. And that's what Isaiah and Ezekiel said would happen to Memphis. They had different prophecies for different parts of Egypt, so to speak. This is a place where they think possibly part of Memphis could be, but you can see that the columns are no longer there. You can't find statues, except for there are a few, like this great big one that's broken into pieces. This is a partial statue that they think might be of Ramses II. But you cannot go around and see the statues and the columns and stuff like you can over in Thebes. These two areas are 500 miles apart. The Bible has said that Thebes would be broken up and diminished, and it said that Memphis would be destroyed. And this is exactly what happened. DeCamp says this: no details of their construction, this is talking about Memphis, no details of their construction have survived. In some cases, we do not even know where any of this stood. Other Old Testament prophets predicted that Egypt's long dynasty would fail. For instance, in the 8th century, Joel said this, chapter 3, but Egypt will be desolate, Edom a desert waste, because of the violence done to the people of Judah, in whose lands they shed innocent blood. Later prophets painted more detail, and they talk about specific kings coming, etc., which did. Here are some of the chapters that talk specifically in the Old Testament about Egypt. Ezekiel 29, Egypt shall not anymore lift up above the nations. And then it goes on to talk about some other things also. And then Ezekiel chapter 30 also says her foundations will be broken down and the pride of her power will come down. Egypt over the years has been taken over and attacked successfully by the Assyrians, the Cambrians, the King Nebuchadnezzar, the Persians, Alexander the Great, the Ptolemies, the Romans, the Mamelukes, the Turks, the French, Napoleon in the French, and the British, the English at the same time, are all among those who have in the past 25 years conquered in one way or another and ruled over Egypt, just like the Bible says. In the 3,000 years, I'm going to have to put a clock up here because I was thinking that was a different time. I'm almost done. In the 3,000-year history of Egypt, there were 70 different pharaohs who ruled over 30 different dynasties. But Ezekiel chapter 13 says there will be no more native prince that come out of Egypt. Ezekiel was right. There is no one that can trace their lineage back to the pharaohs of Egypt nowadays. That's not to say that we don't know who those pharaohs are, because we know who quite a few of them are, and we know what they accomplished, and we know what Egypt could do. But no one today can trace their lineage back to those Egyptian pharaohs. It was said that way by Ezekiel, and it came true. What we're going to find out is that this prediction made as far as very specific. You're never going to be able to trace your lineage back to the pharaohs, but it never says anything specifically about the pharaohs themselves not being known who they were, and etc. This is going to be very, very different than next week's lesson when we talk about Edom, where we know where the temples are, but all of the information about any of those kings and who those temples were, who those burial sites were for, totally gone. We don't know a single name. And that's the way the Bible said it would happen. You see how this is very specific to each nation, and one isn't like the other? These follow those rules that we said at the beginning very, very precisely. Any questions? All right.